Okay, so here we're just going to talk sort of overall about minds and how philosophers approach the question of what is a mind. So we might think that mind is, or thinking is the same thing as consciousness, that they're both mental states, and think that in order to think, understand, have consciousness, and possess other mental states requires having a mind. I think this is sort of our default view as just normal human beings, that we think that stuff that's conscious has mental states such as beliefs and desires, think that we understand stuff, and that, all these things require having a mind. But some philosophers don't equate all these things. They define thought as a connection between us and the world. So maybe a thought is about something in the sense that we can think about rats or dogs or cats or whatever we want to think about. Why is this important? We'll see in a minute. So, interestingly, thoughts are about stuff. Yeah, you don't just think, you think about something. Beliefs and desires are also about something. So we believe that dogs exist. We desire to have a dog. Beliefs and desires, they can be classified as kinds of thoughts or mental states, but there's also something that philosophers call propositional attitudes. So a propositional attitude is the relationship between a person and a proposition. Remember, the proposition is basically just the content of a sentence. So if we say something like, I believe dogs exist, that expresses an attitude, or which I have, which is a belief. So my belief is an attitude that I have toward a proposition, dogs exist. So to say I believe dogs exist is to say that I have this relationship to this proposition. Weirdly, this is the same thing we just said about thought. So you'll see as we go through this chapter that philosophers do talk about these things in different kinds of ways. They don't all categorize thoughts in the same way, or beliefs and desires, and the way they talk about whether stuff has minds and consciousness varies, and that will become important on the views that they end up espousing, that they argue for based on these kind of ideas. So then we also have this idea of consciousness. Well, many philosophers separate the idea of consciousness from having thoughts. Some do, some don't. And it seems like perhaps this might allow us to think that machines could be capable of thinking but not of having consciousness, some people think. So consciousness might mean in part that we have mental states related to our thoughts. So you might think about rats, for example. So that's a thought about something, a rat, and you can also have an emotional reaction. And that, some philosophers count that emotional reaction as consciousness. So if you fear rats, then you have, when you think about rats, you have this emotional reaction, and perhaps that is part of what consciousness means. And if this is true, then it seems that a machine or another entity could perhaps have thoughts without having consciousness. So they could have the thought about a rat, but not have the emotional response or consciousness response to that thought. But weirdly, this might entail that we could think or represent that we're conscious without actually being conscious. So the machine could have the thought, I am conscious. So it has a thought about consciousness and about itself, but not actually be conscious if it doesn't have any kind of emotional reaction or reaction to that thought. So weirdly, that's one of the ways that philosophers talk about the difference between machine thinking, if you want to call it that, and consciousness. But it's only one way of doing that. There's also something called cognitive experience, and some philosophers, such as Philip Goff, talk about this. It's kind of a little bit like the phenomenology that we talked about in the last chapter, but here consciousness explains all mental representation, including thoughts. So there's no consciousness separation between consciousness and thinking. It's just cognitive experience. Other philosophers, like Daniel Dennett, argue that we really don't have consciousness. It's just an illusion. So there's no such thing as a subjective experience, but just a multitude of processes happening in the brain. So in that, on this view, obviously, machines, it seems like at least, machines could have, it could think just as much as us, because we really don't have this extra thing called consciousness that some people posit. So consciousness is sometimes also equated with the idea of self-consciousness, or the awareness of ourselves, and perhaps this is the sort of normal common sense view. Maybe it's not, but we're interestingly, psychologists and people who study animals conclude that animals are self-conscious if they can recognize themselves in the mirror, or other tests such as having being able to follow the eye gaze of other animals, understanding the perspective of another animal. If they have these abilities, then they say that they have they can think, or they have minds, or they have consciousness. Consciousness can also be defined, and sometimes defined, to be an awareness of your own mental states. This is similar but different. You can be aware of yourself as an entity, maybe, but not be aware of your own mental states. I don't know. Again, this is something a lot that people argue about. But it does seem to be that the case. Most philosophers agree that being a conscious being doesn't depend on whether one's conscious at any particular moment. The way we talk about consciousness sometimes in common sense is to say, well, that person's unconscious, meaning that they are passed out or in a deep state of sleep or something like that. But it still seems like we would say they are a conscious being. So are they conscious when they are passed out, or did they sort of lose their status as a conscious being for a short period of time? And again, this is something that people argue about. So for some philosophers like David Papineau, we are conscious when we're passed out or in a deep sleep, but even though we may not have memories of what happens during that time. So we can argue about whether we have memories of ourselves when we sleep, but we certainly don't remember the whole time we're sleeping, and when we are passed out, we don't remember that. So he says that, okay, we were conscious during that time, it's just that we weren't making memories, and memory to him is taking that conscious experience and making sense out of it. So we're not doing that when we're asleep or when we are passed out, but that doesn't mean we're not conscious during that time. So they say that he says that it's simpler to assume that we continue to be conscious in these states, because it seems weird to say that consciousness is something over and above the brain working, and that sort of somehow turns off when we are passed out or sleeping, whereas the brain continues to work to keep us alive and make us breathe and all that other stuff. So he says, look, consciousness is really just a physical brain process. It doesn't go away as long as the brain is working. So unless we die, he says, we don't stop having consciousness just when we're quote unquote unconscious. Again, this isn't what everybody thinks, this is just what he thinks in particular. But all this is just mostly to show that there are different ways of talking about and categorizing mental events and our mental lives and experience, and all these different terms that philosophers use. And what they focus on and how they define these terms when they're developing their theories will affect the kind of picture that they're going to come up with. So kind of keeping these categories and these differences in mind is going to be helpful as we continue to talk about mind and what it means and whether computers can have minds.